All right, so let's continue on the chapter for chapter 6. And if we look into this, defining a function, right, the order of the function in a program does not really matter. Although usually we have the main function to go first because it's the first program that runs. And usually the main function is the driver function, right? So the main function basically calls all the other functions that you have in your program, right? And also it gives a reader, or someone who reads your code, the overall program concept before details of each other function is accounted. So when you're reading some code, you usually look for the main function first, so that you can follow the order of things that are being called, right? Because the main function basically calls the other functions, right? So each function must be defined outside any other functions. So you cannot have a function inside a function, right? You can call a function within a function, but you cannot basically define functions inside another function, right? So nesting function is never permitted, right? So keep a note of that. No nested functions, right? No nested functions, right? This is don't exist, right? Don't do it, right? You're gonna get nasty compilation errors, right? And that's one of the ideas, right? So when you create a function, in this exercise example here, we have a function called calculate average, right? So you can think about how you would want to write this function, right? So basically an average, you can use this call average to basically average out two numbers, right? So you can call the empty function call average, right? It'll create the function, right? uh, it'll pass the two input from the user as an argument to the function calculate average, right? So the idea is to calculate the total, right? And print out the average of these two numbers, right? Now think about it, because if you have two input and you call the empty function call average, right? Then how are you gonna pass the two inputs from users as argument to the function calculate average, right? So think about the kind of parameter declaration that you're gonna need, right? Now, you can also use a possible programming approach. Basically, um, you know, create a function stub, right? Basically, this it's a stub is a beginning of a final function, right? And it can be used as a placeholder for a function until the function is completed, right? It's basically a fake function that accepts parameters and return values in proper form, incomplete but maybe working, right? It allows main to be compiled and tested before all functions are basically completed. Let's look at this idea here, right? So this is an example of a stub. So you can put a double, it has certain kinds of return value, uh, and it has some variables defined, right? But the steps functions are not yet defined, right? So this is basically a example of the stub. And your program could possibly call a function. It may not return calculate average very well right now, right? So someone would have to enable or write the code for this, right? So as previously said, we have calculate average. This is something similar, right? And you take two integers and the main function would call it, right? So if you're still working with the function and you don't want to have some kind of compilation error, you can start with some kind of a stub to and write the code as you go on, right? So you can have functions with empty parameters, right? And if you have empty parameters, then you would leave it empty, or basically void, right? So you are expecting nothing to be returned or returning some kind of void, right? So if you have an empty parameter, then this is the prototype declaration that you function declaration that you'll be using, right? Okay, so okay, some of the default a function can have, or the parameters themselves can have default arguments, right? So if we look into arguments and defaulting the particular arguments, right? And this can be defined basically in your function prototype, right? So basically you can have void example int equal to 5, double equals to 6.78, right? Now this is especially useful when you want to create default values for the functions, right? So there are many ways to use this kind when you have function default arguments. So if you can call one function, for example, here if you have a function called example with default values for the second parameter and the third parameter, you can call the function with all three parameters, or you can just use two parameters, right? Where you use the first parameter and second parameter, right? Changing the integer values here to number 2, right? But the double value remains at 6.78 as a default value, right? So this will in turn make it a default value. Or you can use example 7 just so it will immediately use the first argument, right? So okay, so let's take a break, have a coffee, see you in the next series, right? So I'll see you back in the next video series.